Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming to Empower 2021 and welcome. We are here today with John from Canopy. He is going to talk about resilience in the next normal. Amazing session. I'm such a huge fan. Thank you for joining us, John, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mihai, and hello, everyone. And I'm so glad to have this time to hang out together in this most interesting season that we've been in together. And resiliency has been such an important key to make it through 2020, and it will be so important to help us thrive in the next normal. So I'm just thrilled to get to hang out with you guys a little bit today. I think of 2020 much like the movie Jumanji, and you keep waiting for the next drum beat, the next pounding sound to happen. And I love that Jumanji was called The Next Level, and we're going to move from the next level of Jumanji to the next normal of 2021. And what is so critical for us as leaders in the nonprofit space is to realize that our resiliency and the way that we lead, that the tone that we set is got to communicate the meta message of being able to, how do we bounce back and adapt well? How do we remain nimble? A word we invented in our organization, nimbility. How do we have that nimbility? And resiliency drives that in an amazing way. Just so you have a brief context, I'm CEO of Canopy Children's Solutions, which is the largest nonprofit in Mississippi, Save the Hospitals, and we do behavioral health for kids, and everything from adoption and psychiatric residential treatment to home-based services and autism services and schools and foster care and everything in between. And we've partnered with great groups like Microsoft, who are co-sponsoring this event, to really drive innovation and reimagine how we can deliver those services. And so I'm thrilled to get to hang out with you guys today. Here's the big picture for today. Three points. One, I want to kind of just give you the really broad strokes about how do we inoculate our brains, and by extension as leaders, communicate how to inoculate our employees' brains around change as a new normal. And why does it matter? Why does resiliency matter? What does it really look like? Second big idea is kind of this multidimensional impact that we're having now on our workforce. And as you're hiring and recruiting and doing what you do, to have a really good idea about the topology of people's lives as they come into your place. And I think that's important to talk about for a minute. And then finally, we'll land on some actions that we can take. First, let's talk about the big picture and how do we think rightly about this moment. And it's everything. How we think drives how we feel, drives how we act. So how do we think rightly right now about this moment and inoculate our brain? And I came across this letter from C.S. Lewis, great writer, hero, who really captured for me the right way to think about this past year. And he said this in this letter in 1943. The great thing, if one can, is to stop regarding all the unpleasant things. Think about 2020, all the unpleasant things. Stop thinking about the unpleasant things as interruptions of one's own or real life. The truth is, of course, that what one calls the interruptions are precisely one's real life. The life God's sending one day by day, what one calls one's real life is a phantom of one's own imagination. And the more I thought about that quote, I began to realize how much I was missing in the moment, because all I was thinking about is, I can't wait to get back to real life. I can't wait to get back to the real normal. And you're missing the moments right in front of you. This is our real life. And in so many ways, all that we've been through, the interruptions of COVID and political unrest and racial injustice, all of this is part of our real life right now. And how do we think rightly about it? And I want to give you one more thought on thinking rightly. It's called the Stockdale paradox. You may have heard of this before, but I think fresh about this idea in this next normal that we're in. Admiral Stockdale was the highest ranking military officer to ever be held captive as a prisoner of war, Vietnam War, in the Hanoi Hilton, and he was tortured over 20-something times over 8 years. Just a really tough situation. And many of his colleagues who were in the same prisoner of war camp received the same treatment, same abuse, same neglect, same food, everything, but they did not survive. And when Stockdale got out, it was noticed that he really didn't only survive, he was thriving. And the question was, why is it that you're thriving and your colleagues over here didn't survive at all? And he had a very interesting answer. His answer was because they are the optimist. And I think, well, I want to be an optimist. I like to be known as an optimistic person. But what we learn from Stockdale right now about how we create resiliency and the right kind of hope for our people is critical. What he said is that they said they had the wrong kind of hope, a false hope, that I'll be home for Christmas. And then Christmas came and went and came and went and came and went. And eventually they give up hope. And hopelessness, biggest predictor of suicide and depression and all sorts of things. But over here, Stockdale said, his mindset was, I will be home for Christmas. But it may not be this year. It's probably not going to be next year. It may not be the year after that. It may not be the year after that. But I will one day be home for Christmas. That realistic optimism is critical in keeping hope and having a mindset of resiliency. And how you lead your organizations with realistic optimism is everything in embedding real hope and embedding resiliency in your organization. So why build resiliency? The absence of resiliency leaves us in the presence of stress, and stress plays itself out, particularly in relationships, in our health, and in our workplace. These are the Russian nesting dolls that we saw of 2020, of a crisis within a crisis, nested within a crisis. You just didn't know when it was going to end. And when that stress keeps happening, there's something that happens with our resiliency, and we've got to address it because it plays itself out in our relationships, health, and workplace. And I'd like to give you kind of a metaphor to think about how to have a plan for resiliency. On the left here, you see a dandelion. Dandelions are the most resilient flower I've ever seen. I mean, they'll grow through the cracks in our driveway, and I'll cut them down with a weed. I'll spray them with Roundup, and somehow they just keep pressing through the cracks in the concrete and can grow. Very resilient. On the other hand, the orchid, my wife and I have a lot of orchids at the house. They're very delicate creatures. They require just so many ice cubes per month or whatever. They got to have the right temperature. They got to be in the right light. They got to be pampered a little bit. But if they're given the right environment, orchids thrive, and they're just the most beautiful flower. And people can be naturally born like this, naturally born like a dandelion that's extremely resilient naturally, or an orchid that really has to have the right context and environment to thrive. And the good news that I want to share with you today is that resiliency is something that can be learned. You may have been born an orchid, but you can learn the skills of being a dandelion. Now, there's different types of resiliency. I mentioned the natural, born with it, and those people are just happy to play, learn, explore. But there's also an adaptive resilience. An adaptive resilience are the times where we become resilient because we've been under pressure, we've been under the fire, we've been in a trial, and we learn to grow through it. And there's also a restored resilience. Maybe you were really resilient naturally as a child, and then some difficult things happened in life, and you kind of lost that resiliency. But you can restore that and learn those skills to become resilient once again. When you think about what are the characteristics of someone who's resilient, and you as a leader, it's someone who views change as an opportunity, not just a threat. Someone who has a real relentless commitment and recognizes the limits of control that they have. They're realistic about that. We also know that it is possible for you and your people to be resilient in some domains of life, but not be resilient in other domains of life. So you may have employees, or yourself, you may be killing it at work and doing a great job there, but really at home, things are falling apart, not very resilient, struggling. And so it is possible to be blooming, if you will, in one place, but not in another. But the good news is that we can learn these skills of resiliency. The top #1 contributor of you being resilient and you instilling resiliency in your people is that you have positive relationships around you. That's just critical. It's kind of like a fire that doesn't burn with just one log. It's got to have many logs around it to burn and maintain that heat. And we're kind of like that too. And this is part of what's been such a challenge with COVID and being in isolation, is that we need those relationships around us as the biggest contributor of our resiliency. Also, there's positive self-image and positive attitude, having realistic plans and not these goals where I'm going to lose 80 pounds in 6 months, and then you just continuously set yourself up for failure. It's about managing your emotions and good communication and problem solving skills. But the positive relationships, and we'll come back to that in a minute, is just huge. So that's a kind of a 30,000 foot big picture about how to think rightly about resiliency and why we should be doing it and why it really matters. Now let me kind of step into a different point about the very multidimensional impact that you're going to face and are facing right now in the workforce. And I want to just comment about the role of experiences that your employees have had even prior to 2020 that lead them into the front door, and how to think rightly about them and their needs as you try to help lead. So let's talk about some of the childhood trauma piece, and then what does the new presenteeism in the workplace look like, and how do you need to be thinking about and preparing for that as a leader? Just a quick reminder at the big picture of mental health and its role in your workplace. 1 in 4 are struggling. 217 million days are missed each year at work. Mental health is in the top 5 disabilities affecting children and mental health. 25% of everybody going to the doctor. When you have an employee that needs to go to the doctor, 25% of the time they're going and have a diagnosable mental health illness. Depression is now the number 1 disease burden in the world. Workers with depression lose about 5.6 work hours weekly. And 50% to 70% of a normal caseload of your primary care physician are really those that have some psychologically related struggles, not just medically related. And one of the big breaking research that's ever been done that tells us a lot about our people and how the leaders need to be thinking about and sensitive to from their inclusion plans and how to think about the diverse needs of your people and how to lead well, is the study called the ACE study that was done by the CDC in Atlanta and Kaiser Permanente. And really they were looking at data from more of an actuarial standpoint to really see what's driving our costs, what's driving our healthcare costs, and in particular what's driving things like chronic disease or disability or early death and those sort of things. They weren't really taking a mental health slant on this. They were looking at the numbers and what's driving those high-end costs. And they asked some questions along the way that really changed everything about how we understand the role of mental health in our healthcare and how our workforce is performing. And if you look at who participated, this is 17,000 people. When I do research, man, if I get 100 people in a study I'm doing a backflip. 1,000 is unheard of. This is 17,000 people. And if you look at who participated, you see it's a pretty slanted group in terms of kind of privilege. It's 74% of everyone in this survey was a college graduate. 62% were 50 and older. The 100% had health insurance. So this is kind of a best case scenario sampling, if you will. And what they found is they asked these questions across 10 questions in these 3 domains around the domain of abuse, physical, sexual, emotional abuse, around neglect, physical and sexual, and then household dysfunction, mental illness, a parent who was incarcerated or a relative, divorce in the family, domestic violence, and substance abuse. And so if you had the presence of one of those things, each one counted as a score of 1. So if there was divorce in the family and there had been domestic violence and substance abuse, that would be 3. So you'd have an ACE score of 3. And what they found in the 17,000 people is that 1 in 4 had at least 2 ACEs, 1 in 16 had 4, 22% of this pretty privileged sample had been sexually abused as children, 66% of women had experienced domestic violence, and women were 50% more likely to have experienced 5 or more ACEs. And if you had 1 ACE, you had an 87% chance that you would have more. Now, this is so important with our workforce and how to lead with resiliency, because you got to know what's coming in the door. And if we're going to lead our organizations to be resilient organizations, we got to understand our people and what they're walking through and what they're experiencing. And so what we see here in this study is that the presence of these ACE experiences lead to social and emotional impairment, that lead to the adoption of health risk behaviors, that lead to disease and disability, that lead to early death. And you see this play out on physical health symptoms when you look at your insurance rates and how certain diseases are playing out. We now have irrefutable data that there's a direct connect back to the mental health side of what childhood experiences. And you can see the more the ACEs, you see the bubble chart gets bigger around obesity, diabetes, depression, suicide, STDs, heart disease, cancer, stroke, COPD, broken bones. That's all playing in the background as you're trying to build a workforce that's resilient, and you're trying to build an organization that's going to be responsive and nimble and flexible in the coming years to what's happening. This is playing in the backdrop, and it's very important to remember because it comes out on how well you and your organization are able to perform and to execute your mission with excellence. Because there's a big difference between absenteeism, not showing up at work, and presenteeism, which means they're showing up at work physically, but they're really not there emotionally to be able to perform. And what we know in the literature very clearly now is that there's so many hidden costs to you trying to execute your mission because of presenteeism, not absenteeism. In fact, absenteeism only accounts for 20% of the lost productivity. People actually being at work, but not really being at work, presenteeism, accounts for 80% of your lost productivity in your workplace. So if you're thinking about resiliency and how do I instill resiliency in the nonprofit that I lead and that I work through, you've got to be dialed in to your people and what's happening behind the scenes, the iceberg, everything below the surface of the water. They may be present at work. Sometimes you have discussions and meetings about absenteeism and so forth, but you've got to dial into presenteeism of what's happening beneath the surface of the water. And just to put some numbers on it, in case some of you on this are on the CPA side or you're in the CFO roles or what have you, I want to speak your love language for just a minute. And I used very round numbers because I majored in psychology, not in math. So I use very easy numbers for the calculation. If you had a company with 1,000 people, average salary $50,000, that'd be a payroll of $50 million of your employer for each employee for your total. So 7.5 days of presenteeism is what the research shows, times 1,000 people. That's $144 million of loss each year. So even if you go, John, my organizations, we don't even have 100 people. So, well, just look at the bottom line there, the 2.8% of your payroll. Now, I know when you do budgets or grants and whatever, like we do, if I can save 0.5% of the line item, of personnel line item somehow by something creative, I'm doing a backflip, 0.5%. This is almost 3% of our biggest cost in running our organizations by focusing on our people and taking care of them. So what are those actions that we can take? How can we really come alongside of our people to make sure that we're driving the right kind of resiliency in our organization? So let me kind of go through that. And one thing that I want to first say before even talking about some specifics is you got to remember, I know in our organization we've got 500 something people, and every person's in a different place in terms of their readiness to change. And so, you know, if you look at the research from like Prochaska and De Clemente on stages of change, there's very discrete stages that we go through from kind of, I'm not thinking about change, I'm pre-contemplative. You're not thinking about losing weight, but then you try your pants on, they don't fit. And the first thing you do is blame the cleaners. And then when you realize, no, none of them fit, well, you move from pre-contemplation to contemplation, which, okay, maybe I've got an issue here. And then you're eventually going to have to move from pre-contemplation to contemplation to prepare for action. This is when you might go buy some tennis shoes or join a gym or ask a friend to walk with you or whatever, but you hadn't done anything. You haven't worked out yet, but you've prepared for change. And then you actually take the change and you start the action, and you got to maintain the action all the way around. How you lead in your organizations around resiliency and hope, you've got to remember, you've got to have a strategy that meets where everybody is in the change cycle. Those who are pre-contemplative, your task as a leader is to just raise awareness of the issues. If they are kind of contemplating change, your job is to help them resolve that ambivalence by kind of, let's weigh it out. Here's the pros of doing this, here's the cons of doing this. If somebody's kind of, hey man, I'm ready to take that action, you're helping identify the appropriate kind of change strategies for them. And then for action, you say, okay, here, we've chosen this change strategy, let's work it. So just wanted to mention that to remember that there's discrete change stages that people go through, and as leaders we have to be sensitive to where they might be. And I also would just add on to that to remember that change is not a linear process. It's not up and to the right and how change happens. It's more like this. And if you scatter plot this over time, it is up and to the right, but each time you come up, when things are going really well and you're losing weight or whatever the goal might be, as you come back down, it can be really down. And that's where the resiliency helps you to rethink the negative self-statements and all that you've got going on in your head that might drive that slope down as opposed to back up again. And having a positive outlook on the future with a growth mindset. So how can you train yourself? How do you train your employees? There's a lot of ways to promote this resiliency in your workplace. If you haven't taken a fresh look at your EAP program, I would encourage you to do that. I think ours is up to maybe 12 sessions per employee, something like that, and their family, to take advantage of their employee assistance programs with counseling and coaching and for their life and that sort of thing. It's a beautiful way to help say to them, both literally and as a meta message, we care about you and your family to be resilient. And we don't want you to just survive 21. We want you to thrive in 21. And here's what the organization's going to do to come alongside you with EAP programs and to help your kids, to help you and your spouse with your marriage, to help you to be the best that you can possibly be. And so there's some self-assessment tools too. If you say, well, I don't really know if I want to talk to somebody, I'd like to kind of do something on my own. I'll make sure that they have this resiliency worksheet, and you can build resiliency with a plan for yourself. And there's lots of different models and things you can do. I'll give you one example of a 4-factor approach where you state the facts, place the blame where it belongs, reframe it, and give yourself some time to heal. And I'll just put that in practical sense. Last Thursday, I think it was, my 16-year-old daughter, who just got her driver's license, the lady pulled out in front of her. I'm at the soccer game watching my other daughter, and I get the call, hysterical, that someone had pulled out and airbags gone off. It was pretty bad. The car's totaled and all that. And I remembered this right here, this resiliency. So what I'm thinking is immediately with my daughter, I want her to build resilience starting right now. And so using that 4 things, state the facts. The fact was, okay, you want to state the fact of the car wreck, but not magnify it. Okay, I was driving, a lady pulled out in front, and she felt really bad about it, but I didn't have time to stop, and it was a good wreck. Take ownership. You know, yeah, I got banged up, I'm thankful my airbags went off. It really was helpful. And at the end of the day, my car's going to be okay, and I'm okay, and that's all that really matters. The silver lining, it could have been much worse. And then give yourself time to heal. She's got bruises and all this kind of stuff up and down and concussions and all that, but she's going to heal, and she's got to take time, and her brain to take time. I use that with the car, but this is on many levels of how you can instill a culture in your organization and the way you think about things to state the facts, place the blame, reframe it, and give yourself time in the organization to heal. So here's 10 strategies I'll just kind of throw out real quick, and you'll have this information. You can come back to it. I know we're having to clip along pretty fast so you can stay on track. Number one, remember again that the number one factor for your resilience is positive connections with other people. You must have some safe, deeper, not wider relationships that you can share life with. You give them permission for people to speak into your life, and they giving you to speak into theirs, and to have some really good, and we can't hang around a lot of people right now with COVID and being safe, but you can have a very small group of people that are deeply in your life, deeper, not wider relationships. That's your biggest kind of inoculation and protection factor for resilience. Second is make sure you limit your news and your social media. The 24-hour cycle can be exhausting on your brain, and you need to plug into some real sources of inspiration. And they're different for all of us. You may love a good talk, you may love a good TED Talks or books or music, whatever it is, reading that is your thing. You've got to plug into something that's a real source of not just information, but inspiration. Third, give yourself permission to be where you are. It's very important. Not guilt yourself, or I should be further along, the house should be cleaner, the kids should be doing better, I should be better on the homework, I should be more caught up at work. Give yourself permission to be where you are, but also commit to not stay there. If on a scale of 1 to 10, you go, right now, I'm a 2. I'm a 2 out of 10 right now. I'm not doing okay. Fine, be a 2, but commit to not be a 2. So what's the plan to be a 3? And now you bring the people around your life and say, how do we get to 3? Let's make that plan together. 4, get moving. It's so critical. If we had a lot of time to talk about the brain-body connection, you got to get moving every day. Walking, running, yoga, whatever is your thing to increase those endorphins, increase all that, you've got to get moving every day. Remembering a time where you felt resilient, to go back and reflect on the reservoir of experience and ways you've survived, and help you to leverage that for the future. 6, take time to unplug the devices and engage in activities that are going to recharge you. That's critical. And you go, I don't do really well with this, but I know some people who do. Find those role models and try to emulate them. Try to connect with them. Ask if they'd kind of mentor you for a little bit and learn from them and these people that you can emulate in your life. 8, journal your journey. Just jot down a word or so a day, or a paragraph, something you learned, something that mattered today that's going to help you be more resilient tomorrow. It'll be a great benchmark to look back on in the future and kind of go, I remember that time back in 21 when I started the year and it was bad. This is what I did, and I really want to celebrate that. So journal that. 9, to be, and I know there's lots of seminars on mindfulness. So being mindful versus mindful in your day. It's so easy for me to be at the soccer game and I'm watching my daughter play, but not be fully present. So because my mind is full and I'm not being mindful. And so those are an important distinction to make sure we're in that moment so that we're not overreacting. And 10, creating hope and not wishes. Remember, hope is a science and hope is not a wish. And if you're only creating wishes for your employees, that's not a hopeful environment to work in. And there's great research on hope and Rick Schneider's work and others. Hope has 3 ingredients. It's got a clear goal, it's got a clear path or a way, and it's got will or willpower. So you got to have a goal, a will, and a way to have true hope. And that's what your people need now more than ever. I consistently ask at the end of my meetings with staff, hey, what are the disciplines you're putting in place to make sure your life and you're finishing strong? Who do you have around you that you've given permission to speak truth to you? Where are you going to recharge? How will you know that you're making a difference? What's that scoreboard? And why do you do what you do? If you and your team can answer those questions, you're really setting yourself up for resiliency. So in summary, just everything we just said, first we did the big picture. How do you inoculate your brain? Remember the quote that we talked about. Remember the Stockdale paradox. Resiliency matters because it impacts our relationships, our health, our work, and our finances. And what it looks like is it might be that you were born an orchid, that's okay, but you can have the skills of the dandelion. Remember that your workforce is coming in with a lot of childhood issues and things that impact their ability to be resilient and to execute your mission, with presenteeism as a big problem, not just absenteeism. And then finally, a list of actions that you can take that need to honor their stage of change and readiness to take action. And that's not a linear process. And then there's some specific strategies for resiliency that I would encourage you to look back over these notes and maybe even that building resiliency plan worksheet. I thank you so much for your time. I think we're getting close. There might be a couple minutes left for questions. And if so, I'd love to entertain any that you might have. If not, I know that they will receive those and can get them to me, and I'll be glad to respond. So with that, I will pause and just say thank you so much for your attention and the chance to get to hang out together today.